Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Pompey Politics Podcast. My voice is as it should be, as had a weekend off from cricket yesterday, which is good because it was a bit too windy out there for me to be bothered with. And this week we've thought you might have been tired of having a range of interesting and colourful guests to provide input, so we thought we'd go back to the traditional format, a touch old school, if you will, with just myself and Simon. Evening, Simon.
Good evening, Ian. Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting spin on it. We thought we'd spare people the bother of having interesting guests to listen to.
Well, I think the more I watch our political masters, the whole concept of it doesn't matter how you answer the question so long as you don't tell the truth. This seems to be. I thought I'd join in, with the Prime Minister. Would you like a cup of tea? I am absolutely committed to the consumption of all hot beverages, irrespective of their background and their origins. I asked you if you wanted a cup of tea. Yes, so that's my spin on it today. But this evening's episode is we're going to try and bring some balance, aren't we? Which, God help the listeners.
Yes, well, we're going to try anyway. So, although balance is a theme through the three topics that we've picked tonight. So the first one is we're going to have a talk about the Court of Appeal basically ruling that the government's policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda in order to have their claims processed, that's been ruled unlawful by the Court of Appeal, which, without shock, the government weren't very happy about.
No.
The second thing that we wanted to talk about is, if it's interesting, we'll talk about interest. So we'll talk about interest and see if we can compound.
This is good.
I don't know if we can compound the rate on that one. And then the third one was the report on this week also from the Privileges Committee. So they've also issued a report. So after their report recently to do with their investigation into whether or not the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson intentionally misled the House, they've also issued a report about how some MPs responded to or attempted to undermine or unduly influence or lobby, and they used actually stronger words than that in their report, their function as an investigatory body. So yeah, not exactly simple and easy subjects to get to.
No, we've set ourselves a bit of a challenge, and again, it's one of those things where, and I think in all cases, there are quite binary kind of positions on these, and we're going to try and go a little bit beneath that and find out whether there is A, more common ground, and B, where try and get a bit more detail behind the headlines. So, shall I kick off with Rwanda?
Yes, indeed. You kick off with Rwanda.
So this whole thing first kind of surfaced in April of 2022, and the position that the government was adopting was saying that their problem statement was that there are people entering the UK in small boats who are getting here via people traffickers, and we wish to deter them. So the theory that they came up with, or the plan they came up with, scheme, I think you can probably find some other names for it, was that what we'll do is transport the people to a safe, and I'll remember that word, safe, third country to be processed. And in that safe third country, their asylum applications would be processed. And the bit which wasn't clear in all of the research that I did, and I did do some research, it's not like me, was if they then were found to have a valid asylum claim, whether they could then come to the UK or whether they then were given asylum in Rwanda. Now, hugely politically offensive. Is that a fair word, Simon?
I don't know, but I'm sure it will come into play somewhere along the line.
So, you know, lot of outrage about this being inhumane. So I had a look, and it was a question of, well, is this something that other countries have adopted? So the first country to adopt processing people, because let's be honest, that's what these people are. You know, it's whatever we choose to label them as, their people, was by Australia back in 2001. So they made it clear that anybody who attempted to enter Australia via a boat would be sent to either Nauru or Papua New Guinea to be processed. And in their original plan, or in their original scheme, those people could come back to Australia if their asylum claim was found to be genuine. That was up until 2018, when they changed their policy and said, well, even if your request for asylum is found to be valid, you get to stay in Papua New Guinea or Nauru. So that's been their position, and to be fair, that was similar to the Australian style points system, which the government talks a lot about. That was kind of where the government came up with their Rwanda plan. So in terms of Rwanda, Israel, and let's be fair, Israel are not a state that anybody would want to mirror their behavior on, has been doing something similar with both Rwanda and Uganda for a number of years. And they effectively have a relationship with Rwanda whereby they tuck $3,500 into the asylum seeker's top pocket and say, there's your one-way ticket to Rwanda or Uganda, off you go. And they pay the Rwandan and Ugandan governments a fee for that. The other country that is attempting to set up an identical system to the one proposed by the UK is Denmark. Now that surprised me, as Denmark is often held up as the kind of a virtuous and a little bit of a socialist utopia in terms of the way in which their social infrastructure, but they have been going down exactly the same path as the UK, where effectively they pay the Rwandan government to do the processing for them, and then should they be successful or unsuccessful, they don't get to come back to Denmark. So that's the kind of outline of the scheme. In both the cases of Denmark and the UK, both of those schemes have fallen foul of the European Convention on Human Rights, Denmark being one of the founder signatories of that in 1951. We came along a bit later and also signed up for it. And the ruling of the court this week, which was a 2-1 for the 3 judges that reviewed it, was that they deemed that Rwanda was not a safe country. So the European Convention on Human Rights basically says you cannot send anybody back to a country where they are liable to experience torture. And I think the Rwandan kind of leadership has not been trusted that they would act as a fair and honest broker in terms of this relationship. So that's kind of where we've got to. If you go and do a bit of a dig into Rwanda, it is in terms of an African nation, it is pretty well developed. It doesn't have the same problems with corruption as some of the other nations. Now, whether it's a democracy or not is a moot point. The president last year was re-elected. He obviously ran a very fine campaign, as 99% of the votes were cast for him, which tends to cause an eyebrow to be raised about just how democratic a country Rwanda might be. And whilst they seem to have a cohesive social structure, there is very much should we say, a heavy state presence and a heavy state monitoring of the population, which would imply that it wouldn't be considered a democracy in any way that perhaps we in the West would understand democracy. So there's there's the whole Rwanda story in a nutshell. What are your thoughts then, Simon?
Well, I mean, to me, um, it it's a very expensive. What is it? £180,000 per person. It's predicted to cost per um per
Yes.
asylum seeker that which I think it was at LBC earlier on in the week said that actually King Charles and Queen Camilla went to Rwanda recently for only a little bit, for about 10 grand more than that. So it kind of, well,
It's-
aside from the point scoring politics on that one, sorry. So it's, I just, I don't know. My reservations are kind of several fold in the sense of, this is a solution that deals with, or attempts to deal with actually the symptom of an issue rather than actually the fundamental issue. If as the government say that what they want to do is to stop people making the perilous journey in small boats across the English Channel, in the same way that probably the Greek and the Italian governments want to stop people making similar journeys across the Mediterranean. I don't know that this is this is the way to do it, because it relies on, to be blunt, it relies on people being caught,
Yep.
and if you want to smash the business model of these people taking advantage, these these traffickers taking advantage of people, then um, you need to create legal routes and legal ways for people to be able to have their asylum status checked
Yep.
and assessed, or legal routes for non-asylum based migration. So there's, to me, it just seems to be a tactic that might look good to certain types of supporters of various political parties. It's it's one of the PM's big five that he keeps
Yeah.
talking about. I mean, he celebrated last month about a percentage drop that was purely down to the weather. So unless he's going to do something about the weather on the English Channel, I don't know that it's really going to have that much of an impact. I just can't
Yeah.
help but thinking that Rwanda isn't. I mean, I'm not an expert on what the state of play is in Rwanda, but it seems an immoral thing to do, to me, to be shipping off people who you should be helping, or at least assessing, either on mainland Europe, so that you can carry that assessment quickly before they come to the UK, or you carry it out quickly in the UK. The reason there's seems to be a massive issue is this massive backlog. What's the state of
Yeah.
the backlog? What's
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the interesting thing there is, in terms of, that difference between the two.
Mm,
There were over 100,000. There were over 100,000 applications for asylum last year
mhm.
that came in via and I'm going to put legal in air quotes, via the sort of the bona fide route, and there were 45,000 who came in via small boats. So,
Okay.
at the moment, it's about a third of the people who are coming in via small boats. Now, you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that part of the issue is the fact that, in terms of in terms of the processing of those applications, the UK runs hideously behind some of the other countries in Europe. So in terms of, I've got the figures here somewhere in my document. If we look at the number that we processed last year, it was about half of what they did. So let me just, bear with me 1 second. So if we look back, I've got my number slightly wrong. So if we actually look back, there were 103,000 applicants back in 2002 who applied for asylum. It fell to an all-time low to 22k in 2010. Last year, it went up to 89k. Now, so there's the numbers. We got roughly 90,000. However, only 29,000 people were processed last year, and the vast majority of those were people who had sought asylum in 2021. So when you start looking at it in terms of, I think the backlog at the moment is about 130k. So if we're only processing 30k a year, we've got 4 years worth of claims to process.
Yeah, so to me that speaks about a level of incompetence and ineptitude. Either the process is unwieldy, or there aren't enough people to be doing the processing. Because it's not in the interest of the asylum seekers for them to be detained in circumstances while their case is being heard, and that to be dragging on seemingly endlessly for them. And it's also not a good thing for the for the British taxpayer, because that costs what is it, something like £6 million a week or something to
About £5.5 million a day at the moment.
a day.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, and again, part of that challenge is that effectively anybody who is seeking asylum can't work for 12 months whilst their
Mhm.
process is being heard. In the EU, that's 9 months. And in the UK, after that 12 months, there is a limited list of roles that they can take up. So basically it says, look, if we've got a skills shortage or a shortage of workers in this area, then you can take on those jobs. So I have now found the right place in my notes. So in 2022, 45% of all the asylum claims that were heard were people who had entered via the small boat route. So this talks to
Mhm.
your point of it talks to the fact that they're people are choosing that route rather than the, air quotes again, legal routes. Now, one thing which it's an aside, but it is for me, I was stunned in that, if you would have asked me, where are these people coming from, I would have picked Syria and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, places across the world which we know to be troubled. But the largest group of asylum seekers were Albanians. And the government is actually at the moment going through a process of trying to get to the point of establishing that Albania is in fact a quote unquote safe country. So, effectively rendering people unable to claim asylum if they are coming from Albania. So I think that came as a shock to me, Simon. I'm not sure many folk would have guessed that Albania was the country supplying the most folk into small boats.
I mean, it's a standout figure. I don't think it's a surprise, because it's something the government have been briefing the media on, to be honest with you. So it's not exactly hidden in the numbers. It is something they've been making something of. Can I just point out something? That the concern is that this isn't it's not a choice, because the only countries there are very, very limited countries from which actually you can apply in what the government is terming legally for asylum in the UK. And I don't have the list exhaustively, but those are pretty much limited to Afghanistan, Hong Kong, Ukraine. There's probably I'm sure there's a few other countries, but it's not as broad a list as basically the rest of the planet. I can kind of take the point of why supposedly free, open, democratic, safe societies, you can make a case that they're what's the kind of the need for seeking asylum from those countries. But I think this is the problem, is that having removed all means of doing it legally,
Yep.
we've created a situation. It's like, actually, this is probably a really poor example to choose, but it's like the drugs trade, right? because there is no legal supply, all of the supply is illegal, and therefore it's unregulated, therefore it's unsafe, and therefore you have actually no control over it, and your only mechanism is to try and catch the small number of shipments that you would catch, and essentially this isn't smuggling retailable drugs into the UK. This is smuggling people into the UK who are coming here with hopes of a better life. So I just find it a bizarre choice of policy to go for, well, we're not going to create any legal routes for this to be assessed. We're not, for example, going to set up, agree with the French government to set up processing centres in Calais or in other major French ports, for example, in order to be able to process those, or indeed in other countries, so that perhaps people won't be schlepping halfway across Europe in order to be processing. Or we're not seeking to reach agreements with other countries, or indeed with the EU, where people can be saying, actually, I want to be seeking asylum in the UK, and then therefore that actually being processed and arranged. We're leaving all of these people at the mercy of basically ruthless people that basically want to just take their money, put them in really unsafe boats, and don't care, because their business model is, you give me a couple of quid, I'll shove you in a boat, and you might get there, you might not. I don't know. It just doesn't strike me as a logical way to deal with it, and it's just inhumane. So I don't think the policy is sensible or pragmatic, even though other countries have done similar things.
Yeah, I think the challenge, Simon, and this is where it's boiled down to, this is where I think it's boiled down to the polarization which we talk about, and the lack of balance. Stop the boats is a kind of, because they're just young, fit men who are, they're terrorists, aren't they? That's what the boats are full of. I always think, if you, and I'll steal this one from a comedian I saw the other week. He said, yeah, because obviously if you're going to walk from Damascus, you're going to send granny, not your 20-year-old lad, to make that journey. But then on the other side, there is this element of and again, I'm using the polarizing language, which I don't agree with, but that's everyone who's in one of those boats is somebody who's suffered terrible hardship and dreadfulness, and their last resort is coming to the UK. So we've got this polarization, which is I guess the question is, and this is where if we agree that it is a problem, that we don't want people paying traffickers to enter the UK via that route across the channel, the question of how we stop them doing that is I guess it's that question of, as you say, it's either greater facilitation to process that claim, or it's a deterrent.
Well, that's the thing. If you've got a processing center for the applications on the French mainland, for example,
Yep.
that's, if you were someone in that desperate situation, you've literally walked across Europe, and you're faced with giving someone a couple of grand in order to put you into a boat that you don't know whether you're going to live from, or you can go to this processing administrative center where you can have your claim processed. Which would you choose to do? Yeah, I'm sure some would still choose to take the risk, but I'm sure most would probably think, do you know what? If you're, and this is the other thing, is what sort of future can you have in the country? How desperate do you need to be to go to all of those measures, to take all of those risks, to get a future in a country where you're going to have to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder?
Yeah, and I think
if you don't actually claim asylum actually when you
and it's an area I didn't research, or we didn't look at, but one of the things, and it's always been a problem for me in terms of, under international law, you do not have to claim asylum in the first quote unquote safe country that you arrive in. That is the law. I don't necessarily agree that it is the right thing. The bit that and I don't know whether there's been research done on this, is whatever you're fleeing from, if you are in France, you are safe. Well, you're not at the moment, because obviously France is having its own political turmoils and riots and everything else. But fundamentally, the safety of mainland Europe versus the safety of the UK, I see as very comparable. So there is a piece, and I don't know whether this has been looked into, but it's that what motivates somebody to take what is a high risk crossing at some fairly substantial cost. As you say, it's not 30 quid for a weekend saver ticket, to come to the UK, because something has motivated 45,000 people last year to take what is effectively a very perilous crossing in the hope of a new life in the UK.
Yeah, and well, there are. I mean, I don't have the numbers to hand, but there is research on that, and it's usually comes down to they either have familial connections in the UK, or quite simply, because they speak English. If suddenly everything went wrong in Portsmouth and you and I were needing to seek asylum somewhere, and the rest of Great Britain was going to be a problem, would we seek to escape to France, or would we seek to escape to Ireland where they speak the language, or would we look for places like Belgium or the Netherlands, where, to be honest with you, speaking English is so prevalent that language wouldn't be a barrier. I think there are quite clear, sensible, and obvious reasons why people choose to come to the UK.
Yes.
But it's also worth dispelling any concept that or any misapprehension that people might have, that people choose to come here because for any particular reason of brilliance of what their impression is of the country, or that they're not choosing to go to other countries. Other countries per capita take in a much greater number of asylum seekers than we do, and they don't have the problems processing them that we do.
No, they don't. And actually, if we look at that, one of the although there is an interesting stat which I was surprised by. Just a quick aside there. Often the tone adopted is that, well, we're full, aren't we? We can't take any more people. We did take in 167,000 refugees from Ukraine last year, which obviously was more than double the number of folk who came from all other countries. So again, a couple of stats for you. So in terms of in 2021, the UK had the 4th largest number of asylum seekers, behind Germany, France, and Spain. Now, if we look at France, France, similar population. Now, we processed 22,000 applications, and we approved 64% of those. So hold those figures in your mind. France had 137,000 applications compared to our 22. But they only approved 25% of those. And Germany approved 45%. So there is an element at the moment of the UK is processing those applications painfully slowly. But in terms of your chance of getting asylum, and maybe this is a contributory factor, you are a third more likely to get asylum in the UK than you are in Germany, and 2.5 times more likely to get asylum than you are in France, based on the 2021 figures.
That's interesting. There's interesting stats, but still, those countries are still able to process much larger numbers of asylum applications.
Absolutely.
So to me, the fundamental cruelty of our process is that it takes so long to reach a decision, and that can't be good for the applicants or for their families. and it's it's not good. It's not good for the country. So
Or and the taxpayer. Yep.
yeah, the taxpayer who's footing the bill. So to me, I think the argument, and I return to kind of my original point is, if, as the government say, what you want to do is to break the business model of the people selling the passages on these unsafe boats. This doesn't seem like this isn't a logical way to do it. It's actually a very expensive and ineffective way to do it. And someone the numbers of something like, because of they looked at how many, in order for this to be in order for this to be to cost less than putting people up in hotels like we currently do, it needs to deter people trying to cross the channel that way by about something like about 60%. In order for
Yeah.
in order for that to make the case, because if it's costing about £180,000 to send an asylum seeker to Rwanda and process them there, whatever the outcome, then it's so again, if your argument is it's costing the British taxpayer loads of money, this solution is going to cost the British taxpayer loads of money. If your argument is that you want to break the business model of the boat traffickers, I don't know that they're not going to continue to play the numbers until there's a viable alternative. So it just seems really wrong-headed of me that that's kind of the way to go. But the point being from the Court of Appeal saying basically that it's being ruled unlawful. That the government obviously are making noises about what they need to do to appeal against that.
Yeah.
And so to do any further legislative changes in order to be able to satisfy themselves that it's not amoral. And
yeah, I mean, to be fair, the grounds on which it was rejected was that Rwanda is unsafe.
yeah,
So that's what they'll appeal on. Ultimately, they can't legislate that away, and that's where I think that's why they're so frustrated, is because there's an element of, if the legal position is that Rwanda is unsafe, you can't send people there unless you decide to. Again, we can't rule anything out. I think the thing which I've come to the conclusion on, Simon, having looked through this, I if we put as much energy and as much oomph behind processing 100,000 people a year, and we were to have similar outcomes to Germany and France, I think this problem goes away.
well, funnily enough, yes. If you've got a backlog and you clear the backlog, a great deal of the suffering caused by the backlog disappears. This to me just seems like a solution in search of a headline instead of a. So this is a policy in search of a headline instead of a solution. So, but there we go. That was
No, I think you're right. It's it does have a diversionary element, because even the most hardline kind of xenophobe, if they think that Rwanda is the solution to the boats, then they probably shouldn't be given anything sharper than a crayon to write with.
That's we should get t-shirts with that.
Right.
Okay.
Let's talk interest then.
Okay, so let's get interesting. So and I'll just remind people while we switch to talking about interest rates, please do continue to follow the conversation and join in on either our Facebook or YouTube. And you can follow, subscribe on Facebook, or subscribe bottom right hand corner on YouTube. Or indeed, you can scan the QR code in the top left hand corner to go to our website to follow us wherever you get your audio podcast, so that you can listen to us later on if your preference is that you'd rather not look at us while we're talking. So our second subject was about interest rates. So the Bank of England, having been given the power in 1998 to set interest rate policy in the UK, thereby moving it from political hands, as that was something that was a bit scrappy in the 80s and 90s with the Thatcher government. So the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England announced that interest rates would be increasing by 0.5% to 5%, a level they haven't been at since 2008. And very, very far away, it seems, from their remit of getting interest rates down to, or sorry, getting inflation down to 2%. So our inflation is 8.7%, which is much higher than most of our most comparable countries that we're dealing with. And I don't know. For me, kind of so the theory is that by raising the interest rates, you supposing that banks pass on the interest rate increase to savers, the theory being that it would encourage people to save and certainly discourage people and businesses from borrowing money, because it's going to be ever dearer to borrow money. So essentially, the idea being that inflation is caused by an overheating economy where demand is much higher than supply. So if you've got a situation at the moment where demand is much higher than supply, and that's not because the economy is overheating, because our GDP is flatlining, so it's not that. It's just that the supply is low. So rather than fix the issues of supply, which obviously isn't something within the remit of the Bank of England, you try to reduce demand in order to match it, bring it down to the level that supply is, and this is our 13th interest rate rise. And was it Einstein that said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result?
Yeah. I mean, the fact is, it's that element of, the Bank of England's in this position, and you touched on sort of the economy and GDP. And so there is an element of the Bank of England, their approach is, to use a sort of driving analogy, is to feather the brakes. They don't, if they stamp on, if let's say a year ago they slammed interest rates up by 1.5%, that would cause a shock in the economy. It would lead to recession. Everybody's sad. So they've been sort of gently squeezing 0.25% here, 0.5% there, 0.25% there, to take us up to this level of 5%. And it is this, it is an element of, when we kind of look at it, it is a very crude instrument. So as you've explained, the theory is basically that if people have got disposable money, they look at the interest rates and they say, oh, do you know what? It'd be good to put that in the bank rather than spend it. But I think that the thing for me, which is, and it's why for me it's not working, is that inflation at the moment is not caused by, or you could argue, most of it is not caused by discretionary spend. We are sat here on a Sunday evening using electricity that is much, much more expensive than it was. Food inflation is, again, and that sort of fuel-based inflation goes through everything. Every product that we buy, is fuel is a major cost to it. We have seen wage rise inflation starting to creep in. The minimum wage went up by about 10% in April. So, we've got this situation now where there is simply, food and the power to heat and cook and do the basic things in your home is not something you've got a lot of discretion about cutting back on.
No, it's not, and that's the thing for me. Of the Bank of England effectively only have one tool, and to me it seems like they're trying to use a screwdriver when a spanner is required. And it's it's the one tool that they've got, but it's a tool that enables you to deal with the disparity between demand and supply. It's weird how much of this comes down to the difference between demand and supply, which I always find really interesting because certain parts of the political spectrum dine out much on the fact that they're that the freedom of the free market is the answer to lots of things. And just to clarify, I'm not an ardent communist, but I just find it interesting that the very basis of the free market economy is you have supply, you have demand. If you've got lots of supply but not very much demand, it pushes prices down. If you've got lots of demand but not very much supply, it pushes prices up. And that applies to housing, applies to labour, it applies to chicken fillets in Tesco. It's the same kind of principle applies. So I don't know. I just
Well,
find it strange. Again, it seems like a solution that doesn't address the fundamental issue. Yes, it will bring demand down, but it will do it by effectively putting the skids on the economy to the degree that pretty much anybody with any discretionary spending can't spend it on all of the other things that keep a service run economy like ours going, because they're spending it all on their mortgage or their rent or their electricity or their gas, or their water bill to pay for the privilege of having their own poop pumped back at them. So I don't know. It just
well,
I don't know. I don't have the answer. I just know that
no,
I have
no,
a feeling that this is the right one.
and isn't it fascinating? And it's only just struck me that one of Rishi's big five is to halve inflation. Now, it's only just struck me the fact that, well, that's not his job, is it? That's the Bank of England's job. They outsourced that.
Yeah.
So, and I know at the time there was some, well, that's supposed to happen anyway. That's what the forecast says. So, thank you for tying your colours to that one. But again, it shows perhaps a lack of judgment that now, when each month the figures are revealed and everyone says, oh, we thought it might have dropped by a couple of percentage points this month. Oh, it stayed pretty static. That, yeah, I think there is this piece, and I do wonder whether the whole, is part of the model, and perhaps this is a tangent we don't want to go down, but we do live in a society of more instant gratification and more immediacy. And I do wonder whether there's an element of, well, if at the end of the month you've got, let's say, 100 quid spare, are you going to put your 100 quid into your savings account? Because now you're going to get 2.5%, which means, in a year's time, little Simon, your £100 will be worth £102. And
£102.50.
£102.50.
Yeah,
However, your £100 will now only buy you £92 worth of goods. So I do wonder whether you might choose to invest your £100 in going up the pub for a slap-up feed rather than the promise of the £2.50 in a year's time.
I don't even have that choice, because my mortgage has gone up by more than 60% in the last 3 years. So
Yeah.
so I don't have a choice about whether to spend £2.50 in the pub, because £2.50 isn't going to buy me much in the pub.
No,
to be honest with you, because I'm already in the hole for another 200 quid a month for my mortgage.
Yeah, it's an inelegant solution, and yeah, it is that piece where, I think we're just all going to have to.
If you
I
say
think
we're all in it together, I'm going to scream.
No, I was going to go for just hold tight and hope, because I'm not sure we got much more than that.
Well, I was call me naive still after all of the years proving us otherwise, that I was hoping that the people in charge would have actually something resembling at least half of a bloody clue.
No,
But it doesn't seem that. I mean, just to give us a comparison, so interest rates as of May this year. So the UK is at 8.7%. Sorry, the inflation. This is, sorry, not interest rate. Inflation in the UK is at 8.7%. In the Eurozone, it's 6.1%. And when you think they're in the nearest trade economies that we trade with, I think the America, is it 4%?
yeah,
It's looking at so and this is the other thing with unfortunately, you're right. The government seem to keep going to media and promising things that are actually outside of their control, or that they can't deliver, or promising things that they're going to try to convince us that they have delivered. But at the same time, trying to tell us that other countries have got it worse than us when it comes to inflation. Yeah, there are other countries that have got it worse than us, like Argentina. Its inflation's at 97%, or
Yeah,
Zimbabwe, where it's 150%. Yes, they are worse. They are in a worse situation than us. Yes, but we're not comparing ourselves against them, are we? We're comparing ourselves
yeah,
against. Uh,
but it is that element, isn't it? Where, and again, because it's an inexact science, if there was a situation where, if we look back in April, the question then is, well, was the government right to increase the minimum wage and universal credit and all of the disability benefits by 10%? Because that is only going to fuel inflationary pressure. Should they have taken the austerity to this time it's really unpleasant approach and said, nurses go and get stuffed, doctors, in fact everybody in the public sector, you can all go and boil your asses again. It'll be a 1% maximum pay rise this year because we've got to fight inflation. I don't think that was the right answer either.
No, and the thing for me is that when you go into the detail of the statement that the Bank of England made, when you look through it, it talks about food inflation.
Yep.
Is edged down slightly this time, but it's still at 18.3%. Now the wages in Tesco haven't gone up by 18%.
Nope.
Right. So I think it's I don't think, yes, the wages that a business pays are part of its costs, so they're an impact against its bottom line. But I'm not entirely unconvinced that some parts of the economy aren't using this as a reason to increase prices where they can.
Oh yeah.
And so it is ironic to hear a British Prime Minister who's the ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's a Conservative Prime Minister, talk about
in name only.
Okay, you can sulk at 7:30. Talking about basically companies making more profit than they should, and essentially kind of price gouging. It's an interesting kind of reversal of fortune. But also the other things that's deeper in the statement is talking about how wage rises. So the average weekly earnings are up by 7.6%. However, those increases are in the service and financial sectors, whereas sectors like wholesale, retail, and restaurants, the leisure industry, the settlements are flatlining. So so again, the trouble with you, and you have to use averages in this sort of analysis. But the trouble with looking at the averages is it hides that some parts of the economy, and indeed some people, are suffering really badly and are actually not doing very well at all out of this whole situation. And this, if anybody dares to get in front of a microphone from the government and say that we're all in this together, I think they're likely to have eggs thrown at them at least. So it's
yeah. I think that there's an element of, I think we're all in it, but to varying depths. And the fact is that if it's around your ankles or it's around your knees, it's kind of, it's not ideal. But if it's up around your chest or you're going under completely, then that's a lot more in it together than others. And I think that this is again, from a personal perspective, I used to love it at 0.25, because back in those heady days of the 90s under the nice Mr. Tony Blair, I got myself a cheeky little lifetime of the mortgage Bank of England base rate plus 1%. So I was laughing for a number of years. I'm not sure that I'm laughing quite as hard now, but I know I'm in a better situation than anybody else who's going on a fixed variable at the moment trying to get a new deal. So yes, tough times indeed.
Yeah. And again, I repeat, we're not here to provide the answers. We're just providing the commentary on what's happening,
and a balanced commentary.
cleverer heads than ours would have ideas, but you want to push all the levers rather than just continually pushing one and hoping that it works.
Yeah.
In that one. So, what was the last topic?
Privilege. Privilege,
And
I tell you.
What a privilege it is to discuss it. So, so on June 30th, basically the Privileges Committee. So in line with, as I said at the top of the show, their report that they issued, was it last week or the week before? I can't remember now. The whole Johnson thing. It feels like
ages. Yep.
a lifetime ago. It's certainly a political. So the Privilege Committee basically issued a report where they highlighted some real deep concerns about the conduct of some MPs and how they had attempted to lobby, or even beyond lobby, influence, undermine, and nay, probably even bully, would be paraphrasing probably their surnames. Their own words. But yeah, so the Privilege Committee, which I remind everybody is made up of 4 Conservative MPs, 2 Labour MPs, and 1 SNP MP, were even subject to an email campaign from, was it Conservative Democracy Organisation, who'd sorted out an email campaign, and they received 600 emails basically calling on the Conservative members of that committee to stand down and renounce it. There were various other MPs, the likes of Nadine Dorries, the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the likes of Michael Fabricant, and others that were cited and in the report, in this report. And thankfully it's a much shorter report than the one they gave the other week into the investigation into former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They cite the examples of the things that these MPs have said, essentially calling on it being investigated, that these Conservative MPs don't find themselves parachuted into a safe seat, calling it a kangaroo court, calling it basically a mob just basically out to get Boris Johnson, all those sorts of things. And essentially that, in the context of the Privileges Committee, is the only mechanism by which anyone in the House of Commons can be brought to book for basically lying, to or deliberately misinforming the House of Commons, or any other sort of conduct. So normally the convention, and this is one of the wonders of an unwritten constitution, one of the conventions is that if a minister happens to misinform the House, which sometimes happen, they quote the wrong figure, for example, then they are relied upon to correct the record at the earliest opportunity.
Yep.
If they've deliberately or seem to be deliberately and recklessly misinforming the House, which is essentially the charge levelled against ex-Prime Minister Johnson, which he decided to resign as an MP from, rather than actually try to make his case. So the Privilege Committee are the only mechanism by which the House can then investigate those sorts of situations and come up with some recommendations. And if those involve a sanction against that particular MP, then the House itself votes on whether to accept those recommendations or not. So essentially, it is quite literally being judged by your peers, in a sense of, these are all the people that are in the House of Commons together with me, and they either agree with me or they don't. And it is for them to decide whether I have done such an egregious thing that merits the sanction that's recommended by the Privileges Committee. And if that sanction involves a suspension of more than 10 days, then actually the constituents of that MP can actually call for a by-election. So it's quite. So some of the things that they say in their statement, where they talk about actually the importance of. So they talk about, in our final report on Mr. Johnson's conduct, we drew attention to the fact that our democracy depends on MPs being able to trust that what ministers say in the House of Commons is the truth. If ministers cannot be trusted to tell the truth, the House cannot do its job and the confidence of the public in our whole political system is undermined. That's quite kind of
Yep.
any court can't work if people don't tell the truth. That's why you have judges and you have barristers to try and get to the truth and expose the truth, especially when someone isn't necessarily telling it. The work of the Privileges Committee is therefore crucial to our democracy and must itself be protected. If the House agrees to a motion to refer a matter of conduct to the committee, members of the House must respect that decision and allow the investigation to proceed without interference. All of these things seem perfectly logical and seem to be things that shouldn't, to me, seem to be things that shouldn't need to be said. And for me, and it goes on to refer to Erskine Mayes, which is essentially the writing of the if you like the unwritten rules of actually being a member of the House, in that it's clear that to molest members on account of their conduct in Parliament is a contempt.
I mean, for me, Simon, this whole thing, this actually, I find this whole affair deeply troubling, because for me, it actually cuts to the very heart of the democratic process. And what troubles me more than anything else is the cult of personality. And it's the fact that no matter how guilty some of our most prominent politicians are of wrongdoing, some of those high profile figures, there is still people willing to defend them and willing to challenge the very articles and central tenets of our democracy, even though they are clearly they are indefensible. And I think this is where I just, at the end of the day, if based on everything that's happened and all of the evidence that is available, both in the public domain and to the Privileges Committee, if you believe that Boris Johnson didn't know what was happening and that rules were broken during lockdown, you are a flat earther. There is nothing anybody can say to convince you otherwise. You are deluded to the point where I don't know what anyone could say to help you.
Yeah, and I think it would be a lazy characteristic to categorize, because these people aren't, not to be blunt, they're not stupid.
No.
They're saying, they're grabbing a bit of Orwell. They're telling you not to trust the evidence of your own eyes.
Yep.
And they're trying to get you to trying to convince you that the establishment is what done for Johnson, not his behavior, not his conduct, not his lying, despite that being something he's been pretty much either sacked from or left pretty much most of the jobs that he seems to have had. I don't know. I mean, aside from that, people can either be fans of and acolytes of him if they want to. Today, that people are perfectly entitled to their own opinion. But for me, I agree. Fundamentally, it's about the power of our democracy. And I thought one of the things that we'd spent 6 years arguing about was about the strength and sovereignty of our parliament, which is the heart of our democracy.
Yep.
And if the way you defend our democracy is by undermining some of the mechanisms by which the checks and balances it has in place to hold against abuse of power, if that's not a healthy democratic thing, and if you think that's a healthy democracy, you're not a champion of democracy. You're a champion of something else. And
and it is that approach. And I again, it's not one to go in on this one, but again, there's a thread there's a couple of threads, or a couple of threads running in the Portsmouth Politics Facebook page about, still about how Jeremy Corbyn was dragged down by the establishment, and the establishment did for him, and there are parallels. For me, there is it is that element of, and what worries me is that if you look at American politics, and we've touched on this before, a year after the American election, 70% of Republican voters believed that Trump had been cheated out of the election, when there was absolutely no empirical evidence for that. And I think this episode of the potential undermining of the Privileges Committee and the attempts to effectively put partisan party loyalty or personal loyalty to a character above democracy, good parliamentary process, and the truth. It's something that really everyone has to stand against and call it out for what it is.
Yeah. I don't really have much more to say to that. I just think you either believe in and champion. Look, I'm quite, the whole purpose of our show is that we have people that disagree with each other get together and talk about the merits of their individual, of their perspective, their points. I don't know that any of them have succeeded in changing anyone else's, each other's minds. But it's a different thing. You can disagree with someone's policies. That's the point of a democracy. You don't have to have universal agreement. Again, that's a different political model. But there's a point.
Perhaps.
There's a point where I don't know. I try not to get kind of really dramatic about it, but to me, it's actually very, very alarming that you have these things being said by people in positions of power, and them not being called out. That's really actually an attack on democracy itself. That they're able to gaslight enough people into believing that they're the ones that are championing democracy is strange and terrifying.
It is, but the good news is, like a light shining through the clouds, we will be here to ensure there is fairness and balance. So on that bombshell, you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Please do join us next week at 6:27 when we'll have our next show on the 16th of July. We'll also have a show where we'll look at the next what's on the agenda for the full council meeting, Portsmouth City Council, which takes place on Tuesday the 18th of July. So the 16th we'll be looking at the agenda, and then on July the 23rd we are enamored to be joined by a council leader, Steve Pitt, who's going to be sharing us his vision for the city. So join us next week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, etc. Send biscuits, cups of tea.
All good.